everybody. This is Brady Henderson from the First Baptist Church in Gaston, South Carolina, and you are listening to the Menorah Podcast, a podcast ministry of the First Baptist Church of Gaston. I'm here today with our co-host, Alan Ott. Alan, say hello to him.
Hey guys, how we doing this week?
So we are already a little halfway over July, and if you are listening in South Carolina, Alan, I don't know if you noticed, we have listeners from all across the country, Michigan, Colorado, Florida, Texas, but I would say the majority of our listeners are in South Carolina, and if you are, it's hot.
It's very hot.
It's South Carolina in the middle of July. But hey, just want to remind you guys why we do what we do here at the Menorah Podcast. We seek to share the light, speak the light, and send the light of Jesus Christ through the airwaves every single week. So what we're going to talk about today is something pretty interesting that we have not talked about before. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a book that was written. Now, I do want to tell you up front, this book is a little dated when it comes to the topic that we're going to be discussing. But I want to talk to you today about the different generations in a church. One thing that makes a church different from any kind of other organization, whether that's secular or any other kind of organization, is that for the majority, there are so many different groups of people and also ages of people. Recently, I tried to conquer the hard task of figuring out the average age of our church, and I roughly came up with the number 42. Is the average age of our church when you count all the little babies and then you count all the elderly and everybody in between. That is a really good place to be. I talked with a pastor earlier this week. His average congregation is about 59. I would say most Southern Baptist churches are over the 60 number. And so when you're dealing with a church, you're dealing with most of the time 4 different generations. Now, this book that I'm going to be referencing in today's episode is called One Church, 4 Generations, Understanding and Reaching All Ages in Your Church. And it was written by a man named Gary McIntosh. And so I don't encourage you to buy this simply. There are revised editions of this that I encourage you to get because this is 2002. You're probably going to want something within the last 10 years, especially with the different generations that are discussed here. So the 4 generations that Dr. McIntosh brings out here is he talks about the builders, which are often called the greatest generation. That is your World War II generation. He's also going to talk about the boomers, and then what we know as Gen Xers, and then talk a little bit about millennials. Now, he uses different phrases to describe these. He calls the greatest generation the builder generation. He calls the boomers boomers. He calls the Gen Xers busters, and he calls the millennials the bridgers. Now, however you want to talk about that, those are most generally, I'll be honest with you, in our church specifically, we have very, very few, I'm thinking under 3 people that are members, and they're no longer able to attend, that are a part of the greatest generation. I would say that the boomers are the oldest generation that is still able to attend. Then I would say we have Gen Xers, so we have boomers, Gen Xers. We do have millennials, and then people my age that are here in our youth are all Gen Zers, right? We're from Gen Z, anybody born from 1997 to 2012. And then, Alan, we also have another generation, which means we have 5 if you count boomers, Gen X, millennial, Gen Z. They're calling it Alpha, all right? And Generation Alpha, they're still being born. But any of the children that are, I would say any of the children that are 10 and under in our church, which there's quite a few of them, are considered alphas.
And that's a good thing.
Absolutely. So 5 generations in our church. This book talks about 4. So I'm just going to briefly touch through these. And Alan, you chime in, please, and tell me a little bit about what you think about this. And, you know, there are plenty of books out there about generations, but there's not many out there that have to do with the church. So I think this book is really good and really helpful when it comes to that. So just to kind of start off, so it's called the Greatest Generation, and so the oldest ones are usually born a little bit prior to 1925, and so today they would be around 100 years old is kind of what we're dealing with. Let me give you some famous people that were a part of this generation. Barbara Bush, George Bush, Jimmy Carter, Andy Rooney, Billy Graham, and Larry Bird Johnson are just a few. And then part of the greatest generation is also known as the silent generation. And as I've taught, if you've ever taken my new members class, you've heard me discuss this. A lot of the reasons as to why our churches are structured the way they are today has a lot to do with this generation, the silent generation, who were born from 1926 to 1939. Many of them either fought in World War II or they fought in the Korean War, and then their children would end up fighting in the Vietnam War. And so a lot of these people also grew up during the Great Depression. And so one thing that they were not able to do is they were not able to control many things in their lives. And so obviously, I know you've told me many times, Alan, about how your parents were big on saving everything because they grew up in that generation. But as far as it relates to the church, that generation was the first generation, specifically in the rural South, that started having full-time pastors. And so after World War II, obviously churches got a little bit more wealthier, and I use that word very lightly, but enough to where they could pay a full-time pastor, have a parsonage.
I think in a number of times that pay may have been in forms of goods.
Yeah, different goods from the farm, different grocery items, things of that nature. And so you start having full-time pastors. And so you had this silent generation that was in war, that went through the Great Depression, and they've never been able to control anything. And so what starts to happen, and one reason this happened, the biblical model of deacons, diakonos is the Greek word for deacon, it literally means servant. You know, that's why we have a deacon family ministry, and our deacons are assigned families and all that. But prior to World War II, they had circuit preachers, which we've talked about many times. And what our listeners need to understand is one reason that deacons became boards instead of bodies is because they did not have a pastor to be able to make decisions. They did not have that leader to look to. They just had a guy come in and preach once a month. And so that's kind of how that happened. And then after World War II, they wanted to continue to have control because they hadn't had control in pretty much any other areas of their lives. So that's kind of interesting way to kind of think of it when you think of the greatest generation. And I won't spend too much time talking about them simply because there's only 3-4 in our church that are still living. There were about 15 when I came, but that has gone down. So let's talk a little bit about the boomers. Before we do that, Alan, any closing comments on the greatest generation which your parents were a part of?
Yeah, I think truly that was a great generation. They were a generation of givers. They didn't just buy things; they gave of themselves. They gave of their time, and they were a very committed generation.
Going to the baby boomers, one thing that Dr. McIntosh mentions in his book, if you have it or if you want to purchase it, on page 45, is he talks about how following World War II, I'm quoting here, the driving force in financial stewardship for builders was missions. So he calls them builders, but mostly your boomers. They ended up becoming the ones that saw international missions as an important thing to give to, is an important thing to be a part of. Another thing the boomers they were loyal to denominations. Now, I want to also bring up a lot of boomers didn't come back to church. Let me explain this. And I think, are you technically a boomer?
I was born in 61.
Okay. Yeah, I guess you would be. And there's different levels of each of these that we don't have time to go into today. But one thing about the boomers is that a lot of them didn't go back to church. And what I mean by that is their parents brought them up in church from the greatest generation. But through the waves of the 60s and 70s, a lot of them actually never came back. It's one of the first generations in South Carolina and in Southern Baptist history where we lose the majority of a generation. Obviously, that happens a lot more now, but they just didn't have an interest in that. And so I do think that is something to kind of build up, kind of talk about. Sunday school was an important part to boomers. I think it still is today. Training union is mentioned here. It meant a lot to boomers when they were growing up, and so different things of that nature. So that's a little bit about the boomers. You got anything to add, Alan?
I look at that and the falling away of sorts of that generation, and you think about if you have 1,000 people and 10% of them don't go to church,
Mm-hmm.
and they have 4 kids each. In the next level, you're going to have 40 people that didn't go to church out of 4,000.
Yep.
And so as you go, that number's going to up. It's going to get to be a bigger percentage.
Absolutely. And one thing that was really important that McIntosh brings up about boomers is he says that the Cold War formed a lot of their ideologies and things. Television was a really big part,
Yep.
the economic and technological growth, but also education. The boomer generation is one of the first generations to be able to pursue higher education. Let's just think of it in terms of your situation. Were your parents able to graduate high school?
They were, but there weren't 12 grades.
Exactly. So education was very limited prior to
Right.
that boomer generation. Let me give you some boomers that were, according to him, influential. Obviously, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, different people here. Donald Trump was or is a boomer. Oprah Winfrey. Also, let's see, Charles Barkley, Tom Cruise, Michael Jordan, Akeem Olajuwon, Spike Lee, different people that he mentions that readers would be pretty familiar with. But he does talk a lot about television. Also, rock and roll plays a big part. In the 70s and 80s, the boomer generation are the first ones to move away from hymns. I think that's really interesting. Now, in the South, it's a little bit different. But if you look at Christian churches as a whole, the 70s and 80s are when you first start seeing a guitar in worship. And by the way, a guitar is technically more biblical in worship than an organ. Don't shoot me, but you don't find an organ in the Bible. You find a lyre and different stringed instruments in the Old Testament. And so also one thing that really moved boomers was the civil rights movement. I think that's a big deal. And to kind of discuss that. Also, you got the space race, also Vietnam. You've got assassinations. There were a lot of assassinations that the boomers experienced as children.
A lot of events that are polarizing.
Exactly. And so you go from the greatest generation that kept to themselves, mostly quiet. You have a much more expressive generation with the boomers, and I do think that we have seen that in our churches. I would agree with that. Boomers are much more likely to tell you what they think than maybe some other generations, and they are pretty respected as they should be. They also went through the Watergate Nixon resignation. That's a big deal. So he mentions all these different things here. So anything about your generation, the boomers, before we go to the next one?
Nope.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Gen Xers. So Gen Xers are from 1965, and by the way, Alan, boomers are from 1942 to 1964, so you are a boomer. Gen Xers are 65 to 1978. And so some of the influential members that he mentions on Gen Xers, I'm a big Braves fan, so I got to mention Greg Maddux, who he lists here, quarterback Troy Aikman, Ken Griffey Jr., Janet Jackson, different Adam Sandler is a Gen Xer. My mom is a Gen Xer. I do think it's important that, according to this, there are 49 people in the United States in 2002 that were Gen Xers. 49 million. And what's interesting is each generation gets a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger. So I think what's interesting, what he talks about as far as what started shaping the Gen Xers, Roe v. Wade, apparently, was a big deal. Not just them, but boomers too. Video games really become a big thing. The previous generation dealt with television. Gen Xers deal a lot with video games. I think that, the Berlin Wall being dismantled was a big deal to Gen Xers. Music is a big deal to Gen Xers as it is now. Also, the Persian Gulf War had a part in shaping them. Also, AIDS. He has a whole page on AIDS here on page 129. When basketball star Magic Johnson retired in 1991 due to the AIDS epidemic. And so that kind of shaped them. Also, don't forget the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. And then also all the things that come with the Clinton administration. So some of the things that Gen Xers, characteristics of them as described in the book, they love freedom. Many Gen Xers, according to McIntosh, reject the workaholism often needed to acquire money and titles. So you get a little bit farther away from that, which their grandparents, that was a lot different. So
Yep.
you see how the generations change. It says here that more than 40% of Gen Xers are children of divorce. That's very interesting. Different things. One thing, Gen Xers were the first generation that started postponing marriage. He says here on page 134, in 1990, Time magazine reported that 75% of young adults ages 18 to 24 still lived at home, the largest number since the Great Depression. And that number keeps getting bigger. So Gen Xers were kind of the first ones. Any comments on the Gen Xers?
They were more likely to try things
Yep.
that was out of their comfort zone. There's an old saying that, if you're not failing, you're not learning.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of times they push the envelope and they may have to come back home.
Yeah.
Not stay there, but come back home to kind of recover and maybe find a different way of doing things.
I think what's interesting too is it says here that Gen Xers respond to short, pointed dramas that are part of the worship service. Sermons or classes that are straight lectures will not cut it. Kind of one of the first generations we start to see the attention span going down a little bit. So anyway, they also like less structure in their churches. They like to keep authentic worship is important to them. They like small groups. And so those are kind of the different things that they like to do. So last one I'm going to talk about, I just want to talk about millennials. I don't want to talk about Gen Z because I just don't feel like we know enough about my generation yet to be able to discuss that. Our millennials were born between 1984 and, according to this, 2002, but we do know that since this book was written, they decided that millennial generation was too big, so it's 1984 to 1996. That is the most recent update on that. So they were born during the 90s, late 80s, and so I think it's important to know that really with them, you're dealing with a huge technology. They love technology. Now, it's different than the Gen Zers and the Alphas. The Gen Zers and the Alphas have had it since birth. They got it when they were younger. They got it when they were kids or teenagers, not necessarily babies like now. And I think it's interesting when you compare all the different generations in America. The greatest generation was 82% white with 17% minority. The millennial generation is 66.8% white and 33.2% minority. So you can see kind of how our country is still changing, still growing. Things that shape their lives, obviously. 9/11 was a big thing. The millennials, that doesn't include me because I was only 2 years old when that happened. But most of your millennials were children, so they do remember it. Speed is a big deal to millennials. They like speed. They like accessibility. 96% of millennials send or receive emails. This is in 2002, by the way. 69% of millennials. So millennials were 8 years old when this was written. So 69% of them send or receive instant text messages, and 63% download software, and that's as 8-year-olds. 54% of them download music. So that's
remember what I was doing as an 8-year-old, and it was far from downloading music.
So he goes on to say that the millennial generation is sophisticated, they're very interactive, they're demanding, they're diverse, and they want to be connected. In 1997, 5% of all internet users were the greatest generation. 9% were millennials, 44% were Gen Xers, and 42% were boomers. All right, guys, we have run out of time. We could talk all day about the different generations in the church, but if you are interested in this book and you want to dive a little deeper, it's called One Church, 4 Generations by Gary L. McIntosh. You've been listening this Thursday, July the 18th, to the Menorah Podcast, the podcast that seeks to share the light, speak the light, and send the light of Jesus Christ all across the airwaves of the internet. We'll see you guys next week.
See you next week.